The thermometer outside Alexei Makinin's cabin read 22 below zero, but inside, without a fire burning, the temperature held at 41 degrees. Across the valley, Josiah Fletcher's identical cabin, built the same month from the same trees, registered 23 degrees inside, and his stove had been roaring for 3 hours. Before we go further, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of forgotten frontier wisdom speak to you, make sure you're subscribed. Tomorrow's story might just change how you see survival. February 6, 1878, arrived in the Montana Territory with the kind of cold that killed quietly. Alexei Makinin woke in the darkness before dawn and knew immediately something was wrong. The cabin was silent except for the wind outside. Toivo Virtanen should have returned hours earlier from checking their northern trap line. Alexei lit a candle and checked the interior temperature on the mercury thermometer he kept mounted near the door. 31 degrees. The fire had died sometime after midnight, and the cabin's heat had bled away into the winter darkness. He rebuilt the fire quickly, his breath visible in the candlelight, and began preparing to search for his partner. Toivo had left the previous afternoon to check 8 traps they had set along a creek 3 miles north of their cabin. It was routine work. Both men had made the journey dozens of times. The plan was simple: check the traps, reset any that had been triggered, collect any catches, and return before dark. Toivo had taken his rifle, his pack, basic supplies, and expected to be back by sunset, but sunset had come and gone. Alexei had waited through the evening, keeping the fire high, assuming Toivo had found good trapping and decided to stay out longer. By midnight, worry had begun to override optimism. Now, in the frozen pre-dawn darkness, Alexei knew with certainty that something had gone badly wrong. He dressed in layers: wool union suit, heavy wool shirt, canvas trousers, wool coat, fur hat, and mittens. He packed his rifle, extra powder and ball, a length of rope, matches wrapped in oilcloth, and dried meat. The temperature outside was brutal. His thermometer's lowest marking was 40 below zero, and the mercury sat at the bottom of the scale. Alexei left the cabin as soon as first light made travel possible. The snow was knee-deep in places, deeper where drifts had formed. He followed the route Toivo would have taken, moving as quickly as conditions allowed. The landscape was silent except for the crunch of snow under his boots and the occasional crack of trees splitting in the extreme cold. He found the first 3 traps empty and undisturbed. The 4th trap held a frozen pine marten, stiff and covered in frost. Toivo had collected it and reset the trap, evidence he had made it this far safely. The 5th and 6th traps were similarly checked and reset. Everything appeared normal until Alexei reached the 7th trap site. There, in a small clearing near the creek, he found signs of trouble. The trap was sprung, but empty. Snow around the area was disturbed, showing where Toivo had knelt to examine it. But there were also tracks leading away from the trap into the trees, and these tracks showed something wrong in their pattern. Irregular spacing, drag marks, the signs of someone struggling. Alexei followed the tracks into the timber. The irregular pattern told a story he didn't want to read. Toivo had left the trap site and moved west, away from the direct route back to the cabin. The tracks suggested stumbling, uncertain movement. Every 50 yards or so, there were marks in the snow where Toivo had fallen or stopped to rest. A quarter mile from the trap site, Alexei found Toivo's rifle leaning against a tree. That discovery sent ice through his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. No trapper abandoned his rifle voluntarily. He picked it up and continued following the tracks. They led deeper into a stand of spruce where the canopy had prevented some snow accumulation. Alexei found his partner 30 yards further on. Toivo sat with his back against a large spruce tree, his legs extended in front of him, his head tilted forward. Snow had drifted against his left side. He had been dead for hours, frozen solid. His pack lay beside him, unopened. His hands, bare of mittens, were tucked under his arms. Alexei knelt in the snow beside his friend and tried to understand what had happened. There was no blood, no sign of injury, No indication of an animal attack. Toivo's rifle had been loaded, but not fired. His pack contained matches, fire-starting materials, everything needed to survive. Yet he had stopped here, sat down against this tree, and died. Then Alexei noticed details that explained everything. Toivo's mittens were tucked into his coat pocket. His hands showed signs of frostbite, the flesh white and waxy. Near the tree, partially covered by fresh snow, were signs that Toivo had attempted to build a fire. Small broken branches lay scattered. There were scrape marks in the snow where he had tried to clear a spot, but no fire had been lit. Alexei understood. Toivo's hands had gotten wet somehow, probably while checking the trap near the creek. In 40 below cold, wet hands lost function within minutes. He had tried to dry them, tried to build a fire, but frostbitten fingers couldn't strike flint, couldn't hold kindling, couldn't perform the fine motor tasks that survival required. Without fire, without the ability to warm his hands, he had made the fatal decision to push for the cabin rather than stay and freeze slowly at the trap site. He hadn't made it. Hypothermia had taken him less than 2 miles from shelter. He had stopped here, knowing he was dying, and tucked his useless hands under his arms in a final attempt at warmth that came far too late. Alexei sat in the snow beside Toivo's body as the morning sun climbed higher. The wind had died, leaving the forest eerily still. He knew he needed to move, needed to get Toivo's body back to the cabin, but for several minutes he simply sat there, trying to process the reality that his partner of 3 years was gone because of wet hands and 40 below cold. Alexei spent most of that day getting Toivo's frozen body back to the cabin. He couldn't dig a grave in frozen ground, so he wrapped Toivo in canvas and placed him in the small shed where they stored supplies. The body would keep until spring thaw allowed for proper burial. That night, alone in the cabin for the first time in years, Alexei couldn't sleep. The cabin felt different without Toivo's presence. It felt colder, though the fire burned as usual. Alexei lay on his sleeping platform and listened to the wind outside. The logs creaked and settled. Cold air found its way through gaps in the chinking. The fire needed constant feeding to maintain even minimal warmth. Every few hours, Alexei rose to add wood, and each time the interior temperature had dropped noticeably. He began paying attention to things he had previously ignored. The cabin was standard frontier construction. He and Toivo had built it 3 years earlier when they first established their trap lines in this area. It had taken them 6 days. They had notched pine logs at the corners, stacked them to 7 feet high, chinked the gaps with moss and mud, built a simple door, cut 1 small window, and constructed a roof from poles and bark covered with sod. The structure kept out rain and snow. It blocked wind. It provided a space where they could cook, sleep, and store supplies. By frontier standards, it was adequate. But adequate wasn't the same as good, and adequate certainly wasn't the same as safe. Lying awake in the darkness, Alexei realized their cabin was marginally better than being outside, but not by much. He got up and lit a candle. Using the stub of a pencil, he began making notes on a piece of birch bark. The cabin leaked heat constantly. Cold air infiltrated through dozens of gaps. The door fit poorly in its frame. The window was just an opening with an oiled cloth covering. The roof was poorly insulated. The floor was dirt that conducted cold directly from the frozen ground. Heat from their fire rose to the roof and escaped while cold air pooled at floor level. Alexei had always known these things intellectually, but he had never quantified them. Now, with Toivo dead from cold less than 2 miles from shelter, the inadequacy became impossible to ignore. He thought about the progression of Toivo's death. Wet hands, lost function, failed fire, hypothermia, death. Every step was preventable. If Toivo had been closer to the cabin, he might have made it. If the cabin had been warmer, if it had retained heat better, if getting inside meant genuine safety rather than marginal improvement, the outcome might have been different. Alexei spent the rest of that night feeding the fire and thinking. By morning, something had shifted in his mind. He couldn't bring Toivo back, but he could solve the problem that had killed him. He could build shelter that actually protected against the cold. The days following Toivo's death blurred together. Alexei continued running the trap lines because the work had to be done, and because movement kept darker thoughts at bay. But his mind was elsewhere. Every time he returned to the cabin, he found himself analyzing its failures rather than accepting its shelter. He started measuring everything. He marked the interior temperature 4 times daily, noting the readings in a small journal he had brought from Finland years earlier. Morning temperature before rebuilding the fire, midday temperature with the fire burning steadily, evening temperature after cooking, night temperature before sleep. The numbers told a brutal story. The cabin lost heat at an alarming rate. On a relatively mild day with exterior temperatures around 10 above zero, maintaining an interior temperature of 50 degrees required burning wood almost continuously. On colder days, the situation worsened dramatically. Alexei calculated that he and Toivo had been burning approximately 30 pounds of firewood every 24 hours just to keep the cabin barely habitable. That was nearly half a ton of wood per month, and winter in the Montana Territory lasted 6 months. He began examining how other trappers built their cabins. Over the next few weeks, he visited 3 other camps within a day's travel of his location. He asked questions carefully, not wanting to seem critical or strange, but wanting to understand if anyone had solved the problems he now saw everywhere. Thomas Garrett, an American trapper from Pennsylvania, had a cabin virtually identical to Alexei's. Same log construction, same chinking, same heat loss. Garrett burned even more wood than Alexei because his cabin was slightly larger. When Alexei asked if he had ever considered ways to improve heat retention, Garrett looked at him as if he had suggested building a palace. Cabins were temporary structures. You built them quickly, used them for a few years, and moved on. Luther Ashford, a former soldier who had stayed in Montana after his Army service ended, had built something slightly better. His cabin had a stone fireplace rather than an open fire pit, and the chimney design was more efficient. But the walls and roof leaked heat just as badly as everyone else's structures. Luther had simply accepted that staying warm in Montana winters required endless firewood and constant fire management. A third trapper, a French-Canadian named Baptiste, had attempted innovation by building his cabin partially underground, using earth as insulation. The approach worked better than standard construction, but the cabin was dark, damp, and had serious ventilation problems. Baptiste admitted that he gained warmth but lost livability. Alexei returned to his own cabin, convinced that no one in the territory had actually solved the fundamental problem. Everyone accepted massive heat loss as inevitable. Everyone burned enormous amounts of firewood as the only solution. Everyone treated winter as something to endure rather than engineer around. Late February brought a brief warming trend. Temperatures rose to 20 above zero, and Alexei used the reprieve to process firewood. While splitting pine logs behind the cabin, a memory surfaced that he hadn't thought about in years. His grandfather's farmhouse outside Oulu in northern Finland. The building had been painted deep red, a color so distinctive that even as a child Alexei had wondered about it. The farmhouse had been warm. That was the detail that mattered now. Alexei remembered winter visits when he was 8 or 9 years old. Outside, the Finnish winter was as brutal as anything Montana offered. Inside his grandfather's house, warmth was abundant. The family didn't huddle near the fireplace. They moved freely through rooms. Children played on the floor without complaining of cold. His grandmother baked bread without wearing a heavy shawl. At the time, Alexei had attributed the warmth to his grandfather's massive stone fireplace and the general solidity of a house that had stood for 70 years. But now, thinking back with adult understanding, he realized there had been something more intentional about that warmth. The house hadn't just happened to be comfortable. It had been designed and maintained to retain heat. The red paint was part of it. His grandfather had repainted the exterior every few years, always the same deep barn red. Alexei remembered watching the process once, remembered his grandfather mixing powder into linseed oil, remembered the careful application to every exterior surface. When young Alexei had asked why they painted the house red instead of leaving the wood natural, his grandfather had said something about tradition and protection. But there had been more to the explanation. His grandfather had talked about the old ways, about Finnish settlers in the north learning through centuries of harsh winters what worked and what didn't. Red paint wasn't decoration. It was technology. The iron oxide in the pigment protected wood from decay, sealed it against moisture, and did something with heat that his grandfather had tried to explain, but that Alexei, as a child, hadn't fully understood. Sitting now on a pine log in Montana, 20 years after those conversations, Alexei tried to reconstruct his grandfather's words. Something about the red paint absorbing warmth from sunlight. Something about sealed wood holding heat better than raw wood. Something about moisture being the enemy of warmth and red paint keeping moisture out of the logs. The details were frustratingly vague. His grandfather had possessed knowledge earned through generations of northern survival, but Alexei had been too young to pay proper attention. He remembered the result, the warm house, without understanding the mechanism. But he knew with certainty that the red paint had been functional, not aesthetic. Finnish farmers didn't waste money on decoration. Everything had a purpose. Alexei went inside and added wood to the fire. His cabin, with its bare logs and inadequate chinking, felt primitive compared to his grandfather's carefully maintained farmhouse. The contrast wasn't about age or permanence. It was about applied knowledge. His grandfather had understood principles that Alexei was only beginning to grasp. The question was whether those Finnish techniques could be adapted to Montana conditions, and whether Alexei could reconstruct knowledge he had absorbed as a child but never consciously learned. Spring arrived gradually in the Montana Territory. By early April, daytime temperatures climbed above freezing, and Alexei could finally bury Toivo properly. He chose the hillside overlooking their trap lines and marked the grave with a cairn of stones. Then he packed his winter's worth of pelts and prepared for the journey to Helena to sell them and purchase supplies for the coming year. The trip took 4 days by horseback. Alexei had made it annually since establishing his trap lines, but this year felt different. Instead of thinking about whiskey and entertainment after months of isolation, he thought about buildings and heat retention and paint. Other trappers heading to Helena talked about women and gambling. Alexei barely heard them. Helena in 1878 was a growing territorial capital, fueled by gold strikes and railroad speculation. The main street featured substantial buildings constructed by people who intended to stay. Alexei sold his pelts to a fur buyer for a fair price, then did something unusual. Instead of heading to the saloons, he spent 2 days walking around town, studying construction. He examined brick buildings, noting how the interlocking pattern created walls with minimal gaps. He studied stone foundations, seeing how they isolated structures from ground moisture. He watched carpenters working on a new hotel, paying attention to how they fitted joints and sealed gaps. Most people ignored him. A few shopkeepers asked if he needed something. Alexei explained he was interested in building techniques, which usually ended conversations. On his 3rd day in Helena, he found what he was looking for. A paint and hardware supplier operated out of a warehouse near the freight depot. The proprietor, a German immigrant named Friedrich Schultz, sold everything from nails to varnish. Alexei spent an hour looking at different products before approaching Schultz with questions. Did he sell red paint? Yes, several types. What made them different? Schultz explained that cheaper red paints used brick dust or other fillers. Quality red paint used iron oxide powder mixed with linseed oil. The iron oxide was ground from ore, produced a deep, lasting color, and had properties beyond appearance. What properties? Schultz warmed to the topic. Iron oxide paint protected wood from rot and insect damage. It sealed the wood surface against moisture penetration. It was more durable than other paints and actually bonded with wood fibers rather than just coating the surface. Alexei asked more specific questions. Did the color affect heat? Schultz paused, considering the question more carefully than Alexei expected. He said that darker colors absorbed sunlight, while lighter colors reflected it. A building painted dark red would warm in direct sun, though how much difference that made was hard to quantify. Did Schultz know of anyone using red paint specifically for warmth? The merchant shook his head. Most people who bought red paint were farmers of Scandinavian or German background who painted their barns red by tradition. But Schultz added one more detail. Iron oxide paint was used extensively in Northern Europe, particularly in Sweden and Finland, on structures that needed to last through harsh winters. Whether that was tradition or practical engineering, he couldn't say, but the practice was consistent enough to suggest purpose. Alexei bought 40 pounds of iron oxide powder, 2 gallons of boiled linseed oil, and supplies for mixing and application. The purchase cost him nearly a quarter of his fur money. Schultz raised an eyebrow at the quantity, but asked no questions. Alexei spent his remaining time in Helena gathering additional supplies and information. He visited a bookshop and found a technical manual on paints and finishes written for contractors. The book was expensive, but he bought it. He couldn't read English perfectly, but he could puzzle through technical descriptions well enough to extract useful information. At a general store, he purchased materials he would need for proper paint application: brushes of different sizes, stirring sticks, cloth for straining the mixture, and turpentine for cleaning. The store clerk commented that someone was planning serious painting work. Alexei didn't elaborate. He also bought standard supplies for the coming year: flour, salt, coffee, sugar, powder, and lead, new traps to replace broken ones, needles and thread, a whetstone, and other necessities. But his purchase of painting supplies drew attention from other trappers preparing for their return to the wilderness. A trapper named Josiah Fletcher, who worked territory about 20 miles from Alexei's cabin, saw the iron oxide powder and made a loud comment about some people having money to waste on decoration. Fletcher was known for his opinions and his willingness to share them. He asked Alexei if he planned to paint pictures on his cabin walls like some kind of artist. Several other men laughed. Alexei responded quietly that he was experimenting with wood preservation. Fletcher suggested that if Alexei had time and money for painting, maybe he wasn't serious about trapping. The comment stung because Fletcher was a successful trapper with a reputation for efficiency. His mockery carried weight with others. Another trapper asked if Alexei was planning to paint his cabin red like a barn. When Alexei confirmed that was exactly his intention, the man laughed and said it sounded like something a Finlander would do, meaning it as an insult. Finnish immigrants had a reputation for strange practices and stubborn independence. Alexei didn't argue. He finished his purchases and left. The journey back to his trap lines took 5 days because his pack horse carried substantial weight. During those long days of travel, Alexei had time to think about Fletcher's mockery and his own plans. He understood how his project would appear to other trappers. Painting a frontier cabin seemed absurd. It violated unspoken rules about practicality and masculine simplicity. Real mountain men didn't decorate. But Alexei also understood something Fletcher didn't. The difference between surviving and thriving in harsh conditions often came down to small improvements compounded over time. His grandfather's warm farmhouse hadn't been an accident. It was the result of accumulated knowledge applied consistently. If painting his cabin red made it even 10 degrees warmer, he would burn significantly less firewood. Over a 6-month winter, that difference would save weeks of labor and reduce his vulnerability during severe cold. More importantly, Toivo had died because marginal shelter wasn't enough when conditions turned deadly. If better engineering could prevent another death like his partner's, the cost in time and money was justified. Fletcher could mock all he wanted, Alexei would rather be warm and ridiculed than cold and accepted. He reached his cabin in mid-April as the landscape transitioned from winter brown to spring green. Snow remained in shaded areas, but the creeks ran with meltwater, and early wildflowers appeared in sunny clearings. Alexei unloaded his supplies and began planning his work. Summer arrived in the Montana high country with the sudden intensity that characterized northern seasons. By late May, the snow had vanished except from the highest peaks, and daytime temperatures climbed into the 60s and 70s. Alexei used the warming weather to prepare his cabin for painting, a process that would prove more complex than he had anticipated. The technical manual he had purchased in Helena emphasized that proper paint application required proper surface preparation. Paint applied to dirty, rough, or moisture-laden wood would fail quickly. Alexei needed to create surfaces that would accept and hold the iron oxide mixture he planned to use. That meant weeks of work before he could mix a single batch of paint. He started by examining every log in the cabin structure. Some had developed cracks as they dried and aged. These needed to be filled. Some showed signs of insect damage that needed to be cut out and patched. The chinking between logs was in poor condition, with gaps where the original moss and mud mixture had fallen out. All of this needed to be addressed before painting could begin. Alexei spent 2 weeks re-chinking the entire cabin. He developed a new mixture based on principles he had observed in Helena buildings. Clay from the creek bank, mixed with dry grass for binding, combined with pine resin he collected, and boiled down from sap. The mixture was labor-intensive to produce, but it created a chinking material that was superior to what he and Toivo had originally used. It was more flexible, more adhesive, and more weather-resistant. He packed the new chinking between every log, using a flat stick to press it deep into gaps, then smoothing it flush with the log surfaces. The process was monotonous and hard on his hands, but he worked methodically, completing one wall before moving to the next. By the end of June, every gap in the cabin was sealed with the new chinking mixture. Next came surface cleaning. The logs had accumulated 3 years of smoke residue, dirt, and weathering. Alexei made brushes from stiff plant fibers and spent days scrubbing every exterior surface. He mixed lye soap with water and worked in sections, scrubbing until the logs showed clean wood, then rinsing with clear water from the creek. The work was tedious, but the transformation was visible. The cabin's logs changed from grimy gray-brown to lighter natural wood tones. While the logs dried from their cleaning, Alexei prepared his paint mixture. The technical manual provided ratios: 3 parts boiled linseed oil to 1 part iron oxide powder by volume. But it also warned that achieving proper consistency required patience and testing. Too thick, and the paint would be difficult to apply and might crack as it dried. Too thin, and it would run and provide inadequate coverage. Alexei mixed small test batches, applying them to scrap wood and observing the results. He adjusted his ratios, adding turpentine to some batches to improve flow. He tested different application techniques, using brushes of different stiffness. He learned that the paint needed to be stirred constantly during application, because the heavy iron oxide powder tended to settle. By mid-July, he had refined his mixture and technique enough to begin the actual painting. His cabin logs had dried from their cleaning. His brushes were prepared. His paint mixture was ready in a large wooden bucket. Other trappers passing through the area had begun to notice his preparations. Josiah Fletcher arrived at Alexei's cabin on July 17th, ostensibly to discuss trapline boundaries, but clearly curious about what the Finnish trapper was doing. He found Alexei applying the first coat of red paint to the south-facing wall, working methodically from top to bottom, his brush loaded with the deep red mixture. Fletcher sat on his horse and watched for several minutes before speaking. He asked if Alexei was really painting his entire cabin red like a barn. Alexei confirmed that was his intention. Fletcher asked why any sane man would waste time and money on such foolishness. Alexei explained that he believed the paint would help retain heat during winter. Fletcher laughed loud enough to spook his horse. The conversation attracted attention from another trapper who happened to be passing on the nearby trail. Soon 3 men sat watching Alexei work, making comments to each other about Makinen's folly, as Fletcher had started calling it. One suggested that maybe Alexei was trying to attract a wife by making his cabin pretty. Another said the red color would scare away game animals. Fletcher declared that painting a cabin was the most ridiculous waste of effort he had seen in 15 years on the frontier. Alexei continued painting without responding. He had learned that arguing with men like Fletcher was pointless. They would believe what they wanted to believe, regardless of explanations. His brush moved steadily across the logs, leaving trails of deep red that transformed the weathered wood. The color was striking against the green forest background, exactly as vivid as he remembered from his grandfather's farmhouse. The first coat took 3 days to complete. Alexei worked from sunrise until the afternoon light became too direct and hot for optimal painting conditions. The technical manual had warned against painting in full sun because rapid drying could cause problems with adhesion. He followed this advice, working in morning shade and stopping when the sun moved around to blast the wall he was painting. As the red color spread across his cabin's exterior, the structure began to look intentional rather than makeshift. The deep red emphasized the horizontal lines of the logs. It made the cabin visible from a distance. Several more trappers made detours to see what Alexei had done, and their reactions ranged from puzzled to openly contemptuous. One older trapper, a Norwegian named Olsen, studied the painted walls carefully before speaking. He asked if Alexei was Finnish. When Alexei confirmed his heritage, Olsen nodded and said that Finnish people had always done things their own way. He didn't say it as a compliment. Fletcher, hearing about the completed first coat from others, rode back to see the result and declared it the ugliest cabin in Montana Territory. But Alexei noticed something Fletcher didn't. On warm afternoons, the painted south wall felt noticeably warmer to the touch than the unpainted walls. The dark red surface was absorbing solar radiation and warming the logs beneath. He couldn't yet measure whether this made a difference to interior temperature, but the physics were working as he had hoped. The first coat had used approximately 15 pounds of his iron oxide powder and half a gallon of linseed oil. At this rate, he had enough supplies for 3 complete coats, possibly 4 if he thinned the later application slightly. The technical manual recommended multiple thin coats rather than one thick coat for durability and proper adhesion. Alexei waited 1 week after completing the first coat before beginning the second. The technical manual emphasized that proper curing time between coats was essential for long-term durability. During that waiting period, he continued his regular work, checking trap lines and hunting to maintain his food supply, but his attention remained focused on the cabin. He observed how the first coat of paint responded to weather. A heavy afternoon thunderstorm provided the first test. Rain struck the red walls with force, and Alexei watched carefully to see if the paint would streak or wash away. It held perfectly. The water beaded on the painted surface rather than soaking into the wood. After the storm passed, the painted walls dried within an hour, while the unpainted portions of the cabin remained dark with absorbed moisture. That observation confirmed what his grandfather had understood. Iron oxide paint wasn't just color, it was a moisture barrier. Wet wood conducted cold, dry wood insulated. By keeping his cabin logs dry, the paint was already improving thermal properties even before winter arrived. Alexei made notes in his journal about this discovery. The second coat went faster than the first. Alexei had refined his technique, and the surface was now primed to accept paint more readily. He worked through late July and early August, applying the deep red mixture with the same methodical care he had used initially. This coat filled in thin spots from the first application and deepened the color significantly. The cabin transformed from a painted structure to something that looked intentionally designed. Luther Ashford visited during the second coat application. Unlike Fletcher, Luther asked genuine questions rather than making jokes. He wanted to know what Alexei expected to achieve and why he believed paint would make a difference. Alexei explained the principles as he understood them. Solar absorption, warming the logs during the day, moisture barrier keeping wood dry and insulated, sealed surface reducing air infiltration through microscopic wood pores. Luther listened carefully and admitted the reasoning sounded plausible, but he remained skeptical that the effect would be significant enough to justify the cost and labor. He suggested that Alexei might see a few degrees of difference at most. Alexei replied that a few degrees could mean the difference between comfort and suffering during extreme cold, or even the difference between survival and death. After the second coat dried, Alexei applied a third coat in late August. Each application made the color richer and the protection more complete. By the time he finished the third coat, his cabin bore no resemblance to standard frontier construction. It looked foreign, deliberate, and completely out of place in the Montana wilderness. Trappers traveling through the area made it a point to detour and see Makinen's folly firsthand. Josiah Fletcher organized what he called a cabin viewing for several trappers in early September. 6 men rode to Alexei's location specifically to see the red cabin and make jokes about it. They sat on their horses in a semicircle, offering commentary like critics reviewing a theatrical performance. Fletcher declared it the silliest thing he had ever seen a grown man do. September brought cooler nights to the Montana high country, and Alexei used the transitional weather to complete additional modifications that would work in conjunction with his painted exterior. The red walls were the primary innovation, but he understood that thermal efficiency required a systems approach. Every element needed to work together. He started with the door. The original door was adequate for keeping out animals, but terrible for retaining heat. Cold air flowed around its edges constantly. Alexei rebuilt it completely, using techniques he had observed on better buildings in Helena. He planed new boards to precise dimensions, fitted them with tongue and groove joints, and mounted the assembly on proper iron hinges. Around the doorframe, he installed leather weather stripping, creating a seal that eliminated drafts. The window received similar attention. Alexei built an insulated shutter from double-layered boards with sawdust packed between the layers. The shutter could be closed at night or during severe weather, adding significant insulation to what had been a major heat loss point. He also replaced the oiled cloth covering with actual glass panes he had purchased in Helena, mounted in a simple frame. Glass was expensive, but it allowed light while blocking wind. The roof needed work. Standard pole and sod construction was barely waterproof and provided minimal insulation. Alexei couldn't rebuild the entire roof without dismantling it, but he could improve it. He added a layer of canvas beneath the existing sod, creating an air gap that would trap heat. He sealed gaps where the roof met the walls using his clay resin mixture. He extended the roof overhang by adding boards along the edges, protecting the painted walls from direct rain and snow. Inside the cabin, Alexei built a false floor. He laid down poles as joists, covered them with split planks, and filled the gap between the planks and ground with dry leaves and pine needles. The airspace and organic insulation would reduce heat loss through the floor significantly. The new floor raised his living space by 6 inches, but made the cabin feel warmer immediately. He also modified his fireplace, adding a heat-reflecting back wall made from flat stones positioned at an angle. The angled surface reflected radiant heat into the room rather than letting it escape up the chimney. He narrowed the chimney opening slightly, improving draft while reducing the volume of warm air being pulled out of the cabin. These modifications increased heating efficiency noticeably. By early October, Alexei had completed his improvements. The cabin was sealed, insulated, and painted. From the outside, it looked bizarre, a deep red structure standing alone in the wilderness. From the inside, it felt fundamentally different from any frontier cabin Alexei had experienced. It was tight. It was dry. It was ready for winter. Other trappers continued to mock the project. Fletcher made a point of telling everyone he met about Makinen's folly. But Alexei noticed that fewer people were laughing. Some, like Luther Ashford, were watching with genuine curiosity to see if the Finnish trapper's obsessive work would produce real results. The first serious cold snap would provide the answer. October in the Montana Territory was unpredictable. Some years brought early snow and bitter cold. Other years remained mild until November. 1878 fell into the latter category. Temperatures stayed moderate through most of October, giving Alexei time to prepare his firewood supply and complete final preparations. He cut and split wood, as he did every autumn, but this year he made a deliberate decision based on his hypothesis about the cabin's improved efficiency. Instead of cutting the massive pile he and Toivo had accumulated in previous years, he cut approximately 60% of that amount. If his improvements worked as intended, he would need less wood to maintain comfortable temperatures. If he was wrong, he could always cut more during the winter. The reduced wood pile became another source of mockery. Josiah Fletcher stopped by in late October and saw the relatively modest stack of firewood near Alexei's cabin. He asked if Alexei planned to freeze to death like his partner had. The comment was cruel, but Fletcher seemed to think it was funny. He told Alexei that the red paint wouldn't keep him warm when January cold arrived, and insufficient firewood would be a serious problem. Alexei didn't respond to the provocation. He understood that Fletcher viewed the entire situation as a competition between traditional methods and innovation. Fletcher needed Alexei to fail to validate his own choices and his mockery. Alexei simply continued his preparations without defending his decisions. November arrived with the first significant snowfall. 6 inches fell overnight on November 3rd, and temperatures dropped into the 20s. It wasn't extreme cold, but it was enough to require heating. Alexei lit his first fire of the season and began monitoring interior temperatures systematically. He had installed 3 thermometers inside the cabin at different heights and locations to track temperature distribution accurately. Within hours, he noticed something significant. The cabin warmed quickly and held heat far better than it had in previous years. With a modest fire burning, interior temperatures reached the low 60s within an hour and stayed there. When he let the fire die down to coals, the temperature dropped slowly rather than plummeting as it had before. The improvements were working. Over the next 2 weeks as November, weather fluctuated between mild days and cold nights. Alexei gathered data. He recorded exterior temperatures, interior temperatures, fire intensity, and wood consumption. The numbers told a clear story. His modified cabin required approximately half the firewood to maintain the same interior comfort level compared to previous years. More importantly, the cabin's thermal mass had changed. The painted logs absorbed heat during the day, both from interior fires and from any available sunlight. That stored heat released slowly overnight, moderating temperature swings. On sunny days, even when exterior temperatures stayed below freezing, the south-facing red wall warmed noticeably, contributing passive solar heating that reduced his need for fire. Luther Ashford visited in late November and spent an evening in the cabin. He noticed immediately that something was different. The space felt warmer than expected, given the modest fire burning. Alexei showed him the temperature readings and explained what he had observed over the past weeks. Luther examined the painted walls, the sealed door, the insulated window shutters, and the modified floor with genuine interest. Luther asked specific questions about costs, labor time, and measurable results. Alexei provided honest answers. December arrived with weather that tested every cabin in the territory. A massive cold front moved down from Canada on December 8th, bringing temperatures that dropped to 20 below zero and stayed there for 5 days. It was the kind of cold that turned moisture in your breath to ice crystals and made metal burn skin on contact. Alexei woke on the morning of December 9th to find his exterior thermometer reading 23 below. Inside the cabin, with no fire burning since the previous evening, the temperature read 41 degrees. He rebuilt the fire and monitored carefully as the cabin warmed. Within 90 minutes, interior temperature reached 62 degrees and stabilized there with moderate fire intensity. He bundled up and walked to Luther Ashford's cabin 3 miles away. Luther's place was traditional construction, similar to what Alexei's had been before his modifications. Luther was awake and feeding his stove, which was roaring hot. The interior felt warm near the stove, but cold everywhere else. Luther's thermometer read 48 degrees, and his stove had been burning for 2 hours. Luther looked exhausted. He explained that he had been up twice during the night to feed the fire because temperatures inside had dropped to dangerous levels. He was burning wood at an unsustainable rate just to keep the cabin marginally habitable. When Alexei mentioned that his cabin held 62 degrees with a moderate fire, Luther's expression shifted from exhaustion to genuine surprise. Alexei invited Luther to come see for himself. They made the cold walk back to the red cabin, and when they entered, Luther immediately felt the difference. The space was warm, uniformly, not just near the fireplace. The walls didn't radiate cold, the floor wasn't freezing. The air didn't carry the bitter draft that characterized most frontier cabins in winter. Luther examined everything methodically. He felt the painted exterior walls from inside, noting they weren't cold to the touch despite brutal exterior temperatures. He checked the door and window seals, seeing how completely they blocked drafts. He looked at the false floor and insulated roof modifications. Then he asked Alexei to explain exactly what was creating the 18-degree temperature difference he had measured between the two cabins. Alexei walked him through the principles. The painted exterior absorbed any available solar radiation during daylight hours, warming the logs. The sealed surface prevented moisture from entering the wood, keeping it dry and insulative. The paint also sealed microscopic pores in the wood that would otherwise allow air infiltration. The door and window improvements eliminated major draft sources. The floor and roof insulation prevented heat loss through those surfaces. Every modification worked together to create a thermal envelope that his previous cabin had lacked. The cold snap continued for 3 more days. During that time, Luther visited Alexei's cabin twice more, comparing his own experience with what Alexei was experiencing. The difference was dramatic. Luther was burning wood constantly, barely sleeping, struggling to maintain 50 degrees. Alexei was burning wood at a modest rate, sleeping normally, and maintaining 60-plus degrees without difficulty. On December 13th, the cold broke, and temperatures rose back to single digits above zero. But the lesson was clear. Alexei's modifications had transformed his cabin from marginal shelter into genuine protection against extreme cold. The difference wasn't subtle. January 1879 brought the coldest winter the Montana Territory had experienced in 2 decades. Old-timers who had lived through the legendary winter of 1857 compared the two and declared this one worse. Temperatures dropped below zero on January 3rd and stayed there for 6 consecutive weeks. Several days saw readings of 40 below or colder. The extreme conditions killed livestock, froze water sources solid, and tested every structure and survival strategy across the territory. Trappers who had spent years in the mountains found themselves struggling. Some abandoned their remote cabins and moved to settlements where community resources could keep them alive. Others simply endured, burning enormous amounts of firewood and hoping their supplies would last. Josiah Fletcher's cabin was 12 miles from Alexei's location, positioned in a valley that trapped cold air and made temperatures even worse than surrounding areas. Fletcher had always been proud of his toughness and his ability to handle harsh conditions. But January 1879 pushed him beyond his limits. His cabin, built using standard techniques he had used successfully for 15 years, became barely survivable. Despite burning wood constantly, he couldn't maintain interior temperatures above freezing. Water froze in buckets inside his cabin. His bedding became stiff with accumulated frost. His hands developed mild frostbite from the constant cold exposure, making simple tasks difficult. On January 23rd, Fletcher made a decision that probably saved his life. He abandoned his cabin temporarily and rode to a trading post 40 miles away, where multiple trappers had gathered to wait out the extreme weather. Before leaving, he visited several nearby cabins to warn others about the dangerous conditions and suggest they also seek shelter elsewhere. He stopped at Luther Ashford's cabin first. Luther was struggling but managing. His more efficient fireplace design helped, but he was still burning wood at an alarming rate and getting minimal sleep from the constant fire management. Fletcher warned him that conditions would likely get worse before they improved. Then Fletcher rode to Alexei's cabin, expecting to find the Finnish trapper in similar or worse condition given his foolish decision to cut limited firewood. What he found instead challenged everything Fletcher thought he understood about frontier survival. Alexei was comfortable. His cabin interior measured 64 degrees when Fletcher arrived. A moderate fire burned in the fireplace, but the wood consumption was obviously sustainable. Alexei wasn't exhausted from constant fire tending. His water wasn't frozen. His hands showed no signs of frostbite. The cabin felt warm enough that Fletcher immediately noticed the contrast with his own frigid shelter. Fletcher stood inside the red cabin for several minutes, trying to process what he was experiencing. The brutal cold outside was undeniable. Fletcher's own cabin had become uninhabitable under these same conditions. Yet here was Alexei living normally, seemingly unaffected by weather that was forcing experienced trappers to abandon their claims and seek emergency shelter. Fletcher asked how much wood Alexei was burning daily. When Alexei provided the figure, Fletcher realized it was less than half what he himself had been consuming while failing to maintain adequate warmth. The efficiency difference wasn't marginal. It was transformative. Fletcher examined the painted walls, the sealed door, the insulated window shutters. He touched the interior wall surfaces and found them room temperature rather than radiating cold. Fletcher left without saying much, but word spread quickly through the scattered trapping community. The Finlander with the ridiculous red cabin was staying warm while experienced trappers struggled to survive. The story seemed impossible, but too many people had visited Alexei's cabin and felt the difference firsthand for it to be dismissed as exaggeration. Luther Ashford began asking detailed questions. He had observed the difference during the December cold snap, but the extreme January conditions made the advantage undeniable. He visited Alexei multiple times, each visit focused on understanding specific aspects of the modifications. How exactly did the paint work? What was in the chinking mixture? How were the door seals constructed? What made the floor insulation effective? Alexei answered every question honestly and completely. He had never intended to keep secrets. His goal had been solving a problem that killed his partner. And if others could benefit from what he had learned, that served everyone's interests. He explained the principles behind each modification in practical terms that didn't require technical education to understand. The painted exterior worked through multiple mechanisms. The dark red color absorbed solar radiation during any daylight hours, warming the logs from outside. The iron oxide paint sealed the wood surface, preventing moisture infiltration that would make logs conduct cold rather than insulate against it. The sealed surface also blocked air movement through microscopic wood pores, reducing infiltration of cold exterior air. Most importantly, the multiple coats created a genuine moisture barrier that kept the logs dry regardless of exterior conditions. Dry wood was perhaps the most critical factor. Luther had always known that wet wood was cold, but he hadn't understood how much moisture standard cabin logs absorbed from snow, rain, and ambient humidity. Alexei's painted logs stayed dry, maintaining their insulative properties throughout the winter. Luther's unpainted logs absorbed moisture constantly, degrading their ability to block cold. The door and window modifications were straightforward. Cold air infiltration through gaps was a major heat loss mechanism in standard cabins. By sealing these openings completely, Alexei had eliminated one of the primary ways heat escaped. The insulated window shutters provided additional protection during the coldest periods, essentially turning the window into an insulated wall section when needed. The floor insulation addressed a problem most trappers accepted as inevitable. Cold radiated up from frozen ground through dirt floors, making cabins perpetually cold at floor level even when stoves roared. Alexei's false floor with air gap and organic insulation broke that thermal connection, allowing the entire cabin volume to warm uniformly. Luther took notes on everything. He asked about costs, and Alexei provided honest figures. The modifications weren't cheap. Iron oxide powder, linseed oil, proper hardware, and glass windows required significant investment. The labor time was substantial, but the return on that investment was measurable and significant. Alexei estimated he would burn less than half the firewood Luther would use over the winter, saving weeks of labor and hundreds of pounds of wood. More importantly, Alexei's cabin provided genuine safety during extreme conditions. When temperatures dropped to life-threatening levels, his cabin remained comfortable with manageable effort. That wasn't luxury. That was the difference between security and vulnerability in an environment that killed people regularly. By early February, Luther had made a decision. When spring arrived, he would modify his own cabin using Alexei's techniques. Spring came late in 1879. The brutal winter persisted through February and into March before temperatures finally moderated. When the snow began melting in earnest in mid-April, Luther Ashford showed up at Alexei's cabin with a proposition. He wanted help modifying his cabin, and he was willing to work alongside Alexei to learn the techniques properly. Alexei agreed without hesitation. The work would take several weeks, but he had time before the spring trapping season demanded full attention. More importantly, teaching Luther would validate that his methods could be transferred to others, not just applied to his specific cabin. If the techniques worked consistently, they would spread naturally through the trapping community. They started in early May with Luther's cabin. The structure was sound, but typical of frontier construction: gaps between logs, poor door and window seals, no insulation, and bare wood exposed to weather. Alexei assessed what needed to be done and developed a work plan that prioritized modifications by impact and difficulty. First came re-chinking. Luther's existing chinking had deteriorated badly, leaving gaps that explained much of his heat loss. They mixed batches of clay, grass, and pine resin, working together to pack the mixture between every log. The process took 4 days of steady work, but the result was immediately visible. The cabin's walls became solid rather than porous. Next, they rebuilt the door using techniques Alexei had developed. Luther had basic carpentry skills, and Alexei taught him how to create tight-fitting joints and properly seal the door frame. They installed leather weather stripping and proper hinges. The new door transformed one of the cabin's worst heat loss points into a sealed barrier. Window modifications came next. Luther couldn't afford glass panes, but they built insulated shutters that could be closed during cold weather. The shutters were double-layered with sawdust insulation between the layers, providing protection that would dramatically reduce heat loss through the window opening. Floor insulation followed the same pattern Alexei had used. They built a false floor over the dirt, creating an air gap filled with organic material. The work was tedious, requiring careful measurement and fitting of boards, but Luther understood the thermal principle and saw the value immediately. The roof modifications were simpler. They added a canvas layer beneath the existing sod, sealed gaps where roof met walls, and extended the overhang slightly for better weather protection. Each modification took time, but required no special skills beyond basic construction competence and attention to detail. Finally, they prepared for painting. Alexei had brought his remaining iron oxide powder and linseed oil. They mixed paint together, and Alexei demonstrated proper application technique. Luther learned to maintain consistent brush pressure, overlap strokes, and work in manageable sections. The first coat went on slowly as Luther developed his skill. Over 3 weeks, they applied 3 coats of red paint to Luther's cabin exterior. The transformation was striking. Luther's cabin, which had looked like every other frontier structure, now matched Alexei's distinctive appearance. Word of Luther Ashford's cabin modifications traveled through the trapping community during the summer of 1879. Some trappers dismissed it as foolishness, spreading from one man to another. Others paid attention to the fact that 2 experienced trappers had invested significant time and resources into techniques that seemed to work. By autumn, 3 more trappers had begun similar modifications to their cabins. Josiah Fletcher remained skeptical publicly, but his behavior suggested private doubt. He spent an unusual amount of time that summer improving his cabin's chinking and building a better door. He didn't paint his cabin red, but he clearly recognized that some modifications were worth making. His mockery of Alexei became less frequent and less confident. The winter of 1879 to 1880 was moderate compared to the previous year's brutality, but it still provided cold enough to test cabin efficiency. Luther's modified cabin performed as well as Alexei's. The temperature advantage was consistent and measurable. Luther burned substantially less wood than in previous years while maintaining superior comfort. Other trappers who visited both cabins couldn't ignore the evidence. By 1881, 7 cabins in the northern Montana Territory had been painted red using iron oxide paint. The modifications weren't identical. Each trapper adapted techniques based on available materials and specific needs, but the core principles remained consistent. Sealed exteriors, proper door and window treatment, floor insulation, and improved chinking created cabins that outperformed standard construction significantly. The technique spread through demonstration rather than promotion. Trappers visited each other's cabins during winter months, experienced the temperature differences firsthand, and made their own decisions about whether the investment was worthwhile. Those who valued comfort and efficiency adopted the methods. Those who preferred traditional approaches or couldn't afford the modifications continued building as they always had. An unexpected benefit emerged over time. The painted cabins lasted longer than standard construction. The moisture barrier provided by iron oxide paint prevented rot and insect damage that typically degraded frontier cabins within 5 to 10 years. Alexei's cabin, painted in 1878, still showed no signs of deterioration in 1883. The paint itself remained intact, requiring no maintenance beyond occasional cleaning. By 1884, the painted cabins had become common enough that travelers used them as landmarks. Directions might reference the red cabin near the Split Creek or 2 miles past the painted structure on the ridge. The cabin's distinctive appearance made them memorable, and their association with superior construction gave them a reputation beyond simple navigation markers. Alexei continued trapping through the early 1880s, but he began considering other opportunities. The fur trade was declining as beaver populations diminished and market demand shifted. Many trappers were leaving the mountains for mining opportunities, farming, or other pursuits. By 1885, Alexei had decided to follow that trend. He sold his trap lines and cabin to a younger trapper from Minnesota who recognized the value of the improved structure. The sale price reflected the cabin's superior construction and durability. Alexei left Montana in the spring of 1885 and traveled west to Oregon Territory, Where land was available, under homestead provisions and opportunities existed for men with wilderness experience and practical skills. He filed a claim on 160 acres near the Willamette Valley, built a small farmhouse, and began the transition from trapper to farmer. The farmhouse he built incorporated every technique he had developed in Montana. Red-painted exterior, careful chinking, sealed doors and windows, insulated floors. His neighbors thought the red color was unusual, but didn't mock it, as Fletcher had years earlier. By 1885, enough painted structures existed across frontier territories that the practice seemed less foreign and more simply practical. Alexei married in 1887. His wife, Anna, was a Finnish immigrant who had come west with her family to homestead. She understood the red-painted farmhouse immediately, having grown up in similar structures in northern Finland. Their home became known in the area for its warmth and efficiency, and several neighbors asked Alexei about his construction methods. He shared his knowledge freely, just as he had with Luther Ashford years earlier. By 1890, several farms in the Willamette Valley featured red-painted buildings constructed using principles Alexei had refined during his trapping years. The connection between Montana wilderness and Oregon farmland was invisible to most people, but the thread of knowledge transfer was real. Alexei and Anna raised 4 children on their Oregon farm. The children grew up in a warm house, unaware that their father's obsessive attention to thermal efficiency had its origin in a partner's death from cold 2 decades earlier. To them, the red farmhouse was simply home, comfortable and secure. In 1891, a traveler from Montana stopped at Alexei's farm seeking directions. The man mentioned that he had trapped in the Northern Territories years earlier and remembered the red cabins that several trappers had built. He asked if Alexei had any connection to that practice. Alexei confirmed he had developed the techniques originally. The traveler said at least a dozen structures in Montana still used those methods, and several had been there long enough to prove their exceptional durability. Back in Montana, Alexei's original cabin still stood. The structure had passed through several owners, each recognizing its superior construction and maintaining it carefully. The red paint had faded slightly, but remained intact. The logs showed no rot, the chinking held. The door and windows functioned perfectly. In a region where most frontier cabins deteriorated within a decade, this structure remained solid 20 years after its construction. Other red cabins scattered across Montana and Wyoming territories told similar stories. They lasted longer, stayed warmer, and required less maintenance than standard construction. The techniques became part of local building knowledge, passed from one settler to another without fanfare or formal documentation. Most people who used the methods didn't know their origin, but the practices persisted because they worked. Alexei Makinen died in 1900 at age 54, a farmer who had once been a trapper. His legacy wasn't fame or recognition, but practical knowledge that saved wood, prevented suffering, and possibly saved lives during brutal winters. The red cabins remained long after, standing testament to what one man's obsessive problem-solving had accomplished on the American frontier.